Hello everyone and welcome to the Activist Lawyer podcast. My name is Sarah Henry and I'm your host to this podcast, which offers a platform for lawyers to share their story and their journey into law and activism. Our guests will discuss the challenges and highlights of their work, as well as important cases, opinions on legal and political matters, and will offer up advice and tips for anyone interested in pursuing a career in human rights law, public interest law, or criminal justice. The Activist Lawyer podcast is brought to you by the Granite Podcast Studio. Thank you so much for listening. I am joined in the studio by renowned human rights advisor, policy expert, activist and author Brian Dooley. Brian is a senior advisor with Human Rights First, working with human rights activists in hostile environments. Prior to serving as senior advisor, Brian directed Human Rights First engagement with the US government and other partners to end threats and obstacles to human rights defenders. From 2020 to 2023, he served as senior advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders. Prior to joining Human Rights First, Brian spent 20 years working for US, Irish and international NGOs. He led Amnesty International's work on partnering with national NGOs in the Global South and has worked as head of media for Amnesty International in London and in Dublin and as director of communications for Public Citizen in Washington, DC. He is the author of several books about civil rights and US politics. He had an early experience in Capitol Hill, serving as legislative researcher for Senator Edward Kennedy in the mid-1980s, when he contributed to what ultimately became the 1986 Anti-Apartheid Act. In 1981 and 1982, Brian lived and worked as an English teacher and community organiser in a black township in South Africa, which was prohibited under apartheid's racial segregation laws. Brian earned a PhD in the transnational history of rights from the University of East Anglia. So I find this a truly informative and inspiring episode. It might actually answer a few questions for some of our listeners who are contemplating a career, I suppose, in a general sense, in human rights. And Brian and I also discuss the challenges facing human rights defenders. And of course, that includes lawyers, solicitors, barristers, and legal academics. So please enjoy this episode and remember to like and share and review where possible. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Activist Lawyer podcast. I am absolutely delighted to be joined in the studio by Brian Dooley. Brian, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I really need to triple check again that you don't think I'm a lawyer, because I'm not one. So I'm delighted to be on here, but that disclaimer.
I am more than aware. I'm very happy to have you join me in the studio, and also happy that you got to take a little picture of you and Pat Jennings outside our office today.
Honestly, it's really made my day. Well, I was talking
Not really Pat Jennings, but the statue of Pat Jennings,
of Pat
I should
Jennings.
say.
I was talking to my brother-in-law oddly this week about Pat Jennings and what iconic haircut he had, actually, apart from being a great player.
Yeah. Yeah, and big hands that we could see out there in his lovely statue. So that was interesting. But anyway, we're here to talk about you and your work. And we've had a little brief chat before, but I'm keen to find out more about where it all started and how you got into human rights in general. I suppose what led you down this career path? Where did it all start?
I'm not sure exactly, but I think it was a fairly absurd and dramatic start, I guess. I was a teenager in London. I more or less failed my A-levels, didn't really have any prospects. And my parents, I think my dad particularly, decided it would be a good idea for me to go and live for a while with his brother, who was a Catholic priest in South Africa. And I really don't remember much about my thinking, if I had any thoughts about it one way or the other, but I was like, okay. So then I'd been to Ireland backwards and forwards a lot. I'd been on a day trip to Boulogne, but otherwise I'd never been anywhere foreign. And there I was then, living and working with my uncle during apartheid. His parish was what was called a blacks-only area. So there was himself and myself, another couple of priests, a couple of Irish nuns, and about 250,000 people who were all officially designated as black. And so that was a very extreme experience for me, a wonderful experience. I was 18 and then I was there for a year. I was 19 too. And after that, I mean, that radically shaped me, right? Yeah. Living there during apartheid, seeing the nonsense of it, seeing the violence and the cruelty of it. I guess so it would have been hard to then ever do a boring job after that. I mean, I came back completely different after that.
imagine. Gosh. And we mentioned there briefly that we've established you're not exactly a lawyer, but you do work with many lawyers. You work within the law and you report extensively on the law around the globe. Can you just give us maybe a broad sense? We'll talk a little bit more specifically down the line, but just a broad sense of the type of work and your current workload at the moment and how you got into this career and your position, I suppose.
So the work that I've done really, specialised, if that's the right term, for the last 15 or 20 years has really been not exactly on a specific issue. So it's not like I focused on refugees or on the issue of torture or on the issue of freedom of expression or whatever. As much as I've focused on one thing, it's been working with local activists who work on then a range of things, right? So I tend to work with activists who are in very challenging circumstances. So either they're working in under very authoritarian, difficult regimes in Egypt or Bahrain or Hong Kong, or those who are working in areas of conflict. I do a lot of work in Ukraine now. In the past, I've done it some in Gaza and in Lebanon. So it's trying to support local activists on whatever issue it is that they're working on, right? So that's the common thread, I guess. So, for instance, the work I've done over the last 3 years now in Ukraine has really been on the eastern front of the war, mostly based around the city of Kharkiv, which is very close to the Russian border. So I see local activists there doing all sorts of things, fighting still against local corruption by the local council, but also doing some very direct humanitarian work. So I join them on evacuating people from the front line. I see people trying to provide food and shelter in the city for people who've come in, whose houses have been bombed out. But the common thread there is that these local activists are struggling for resources, and much of that work goes unseen.
Yeah.
Another example, I guess, because I'm just back from Poland a few days ago, was for the last few years too, I've been working in eastern Poland with activists. Now, a lot of refugees are coming across from Belarus into Poland. They they start their journey in Syria or Afghanistan or other various places, Sudan too. Yeah. A lot of countries at war, they come up through Belarus, who push them or take them into Poland. And the authorities in Poland have been arresting people and charging people with crimes who've been helping the refugees. Right. So the biggest forest in Europe runs right through this area which is split by the border between Belarus and Poland, right? So refugees manage to get across the border into Poland. In the winter it's like minus 20, right? Yeah, gosh, many people are dying in the forest. Kids, pregnant women, very old people. And some of the local people and people from elsewhere in Poland who are trying to help people by bringing them food and water are being charged by the authorities for encouraging illegal immigration. So I also work with local activists, like what do they need in terms of medical help, resources, support. And, good news is rare these days. I'm delighted to say that yesterday in one of the very big trials, 5 activists, the Hajnówka 5, were all acquitted in Poland. This was a big trial in that it got a lot of media attention in Poland. Brilliant. And elsewhere in Europe. As a sort of a test case of, what are Polish values here? Okay. Right? Yeah. And it turns out the court, I think, did a great job here in dismissing the case, really, which was if you're bringing food and water and giving people a lift, that can't be wrong, right? You shouldn't be prosecuting kindness. So that was good.
That's huge. Yeah. And that must play into other European countries as well. That'll have significance for, I'd imagine, because I think in Greece there were some cases that arose where people were being arrested for helping refugees as well. Maybe it was a different context slightly.
No, a lot of their cases are very similar. In fact, there was one that went badly a couple of weeks ago in Latvia. Okay. Very similar, a woman, Eva Rabisco, who was found guilty, not sent to prison, but found guilty for helping refugees, trying to give them some legal advice. But across Europe, in Italy, in Germany, in France, these cases have been brought. They're generally dismissed by the courts, but part of the purpose, I think, in the police and the authorities bringing these cases, even if they fail in court, is to intimidate people and scare other people off. Even if you get acquitted, I mean, for these 5 people who recruited yesterday, this has been 3 years of,
my goodness, so
unimaginable stress.
A deterrent, right? Yeah.
They could have gone to prison for 5 years, right?
Wow.
So, even though great, we're celebrating today, they've had 3 years now of,
Perfect.
Super high stress. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a good win. I'm glad you could share it with us today. And just specifically in relation to your work, I understand, that you're providing that level of support, but you're also reporting extensively on what's happening on the ground. And I guess I've kind of 2 questions on that. One is, I suppose, the challenges that face human rights defenders, which also include lawyers, but very many other activists as well, a whole range of professions or people who volunteer in that capacity that would be deemed human rights defenders and other activists. There's very specific challenges with those on the ground in Gaza. I know you might not particularly be working there at the moment, but we do hear reports coming from different advocacy NGOs that are saying that their caseworkers and people, field workers, are working under obviously incredibly difficult, impossible circumstances. But also I'm wondering on the reporting, how things have changed maybe with the kind of development of, technology and social media. It's a lot more instant now. Or how do you work in terms of providing that feedback to relevant authorities? Or
It really is radically different from when I started. And, give me a moment to say some really old man things here. But I probably, I guess, one of the last people ever to have written a book, like a whole, very earnest, serious academic book on a typewriter, right? I mean, that would be unimaginable now. And when I first started work at Amnesty in 1991, I remember the day that the fax machine arrived, and we thought it was going to revolutionise our lives.
Fax
machine, because much of our work in those days was typing press releases, like on a typewriter, putting them through this old Roneo machine, and then spending the whole afternoon licking envelopes and putting the press release into post, right? And when we realised that the fax machine could do like 30 at once, well, what are we going to do with all this spare time? That every Tuesday, or every Monday afternoon actually, used to be stuff in the envelope, so you'd post it on Tuesday so the press would get it on Wednesday, right? Yeah. So I know those days, thank God, are gone. But I mean, in your question there, you talked about supporting local human rights defenders and reporting. And for me, it's often the same thing. Okay. So some of the places I go to, great work is being done. There's marvellous voluntary, sometimes professional work being done, whatever. Great human rights work being done. That doesn't really get much exposure. Yeah. And so when I go to a place and say, to the local activists, like, what do you need? Often it is just visibility. Visibility because they believe that if they're written about, it might help keep them safer. Yeah. So, for instance, I'll pick Ukraine, right? With local anti-corruption activists who are being targeted still by the government there, right? What they want is for their work to be shown and for them to be named, thinking that if they're known internationally, the government is less likely to go after them, right? So just the simple act of reporting what they do helps, we hope, to bring them some level of protection. Yeah. In the last year or so, I mean, it hasn't just started in the last year, this whole crisis of resources and funding, but clearly it's got much worse in the last year, and not just because of the US. I mean, the other big donors, Sweden, the Dutch, the British, have already cut back how much they give to human rights work. And so for those human rights defenders who are working out of the way a bit, like in eastern Poland or in the far east of Ukraine, it's very difficult for them to show donors what they're doing. Yeah. And so my reporting on what they're doing helps them with their fundraising too. Very few people will go to the eastern front of Ukraine. Very few diplomats, NGOs, donors. And so they don't really get a sense of really who's doing the work and who's pretending to do the work. And so I can help with that a bit. Yeah. I can go and report very close up eyewitness reporting on, these are the locals who are doing the evacuation work and they deserve to be supported.
Yeah, because we don't see what's happening on the ground, really. Even at this stage, it's the reporting that we see is very kind of broad and generic, and it's the political aspect of it.
Yeah.
But we don't see what's on the ground without yourself and your colleagues and others reporting. And I mean, that's dangerous work. Do you ever find it, have you been there at times when it's been particularly challenging, or what's it like on the ground in terms of people fearing working in Ukraine?
Some of it is considerably dangerous, I guess. Not every minute of every day.
Yeah.
But if you are staying, for instance, in that eastern city of Kharkiv, it gets bombed virtually every day and every night. I mean, not continually, but several times a day and night. And then going to evacuate people from the very front line, then it's the rocket attacks, the drones really are the new scary thing. A colleague of mine who was doing this was killed by a drone in last October. Then it is very scary, but for like hours at a time. Then you're back to the relative safety. But you mentioned Gaza. I haven't done work in Gaza since 2009. But in terms of the reporting out from there, I mean, a few things are very different, right? So first of all, I was working at Amnesty then. We could get in. It wasn't easy. We had to go in through Egypt. We got in when what we used to think was a big invasion. I mean, by comparison, now it wasn't. In the early days of January 2009, and of course we did have phones. I don't think that we were up and running on social media. Everything still sort of went back to the Amnesty office in London for clearance and approval and all of that stuff. It's just slower than it is now, but the immediacy of it is only part of it. I mean, you know, whether, for instance, you know, people are reporting from Gaza now, internationals aren't allowed in, as we know. That's one big difference. But, you know, the journalists who are reporting Gaza now, I mean, if a hospital is bombed, that they can tell the world within 20 seconds as opposed to 24 hours later. Yeah. Sadly, I'm not sure that really provokes any more of a reaction than knowing it happened yesterday or last week. You know, when we used to, I think when I first started doing this work, we used to believe this, what now seems a very naive notion, that if the world knows that bad things are happening, it's going to stop them. Yeah. And in those early 90s when I was working at Amnesty, and more evidence came out about what was happening in the breakup, the war in Yugoslavia. And, you know, we used to think, okay, now we're going to tell the world the truth. Yeah. Look, you know, there is people behind Srebrenica. Look at what's happening. And it just happened, and Rwanda just happened, right? So it's great and necessary and vitally important to tell these stories, but the idea that once you tell them and make them public and the world knows, somehow then they're going to resolve themselves, looks like not true. So then, you know, what's the next bit, right? So I'm not saying we should stop reporting them, absolutely not. But don't think because you can report them, or even that you can report them in real time, that it's necessarily going to end it.
I think it's just the system, and that's what we're used to now. As we've seen, it doesn't really make a huge impact. Obviously, for testimonies and for evidence going forward, all of that reporting and work will be extremely useful. But as you said, the instantaneous reporting really doesn't make a huge difference. And it's heart-wrenching to hear of some of the human rights organisations still working out of Gaza. There was lawyers and activists taking testimonies, witness testimonies, right up to the last minute before they actually were killed themselves. Yeah. So we're losing so much valuable work there, but, you know, we're seeing enough to understand what is actually happening. You mentioned America, and we're looking at Trump's wonderful America now. And I'm interested in your thoughts about lawyers and activists and human rights defenders in America under Mr. Trump. And I know your organisation, Human Rights First, is based in America, and you also worked for a long time out of Washington, I think, prior to that. What's your thoughts on, I mean, are they at risk? Are there people at risk from his manic kind of orders? And
I mean, some, you know, clearly many people are already at risk, right? But if we're talking about that, people who are lawyers, who are activists, I would say we are very close to that now, Some of the organisations, including Human Rights First, were named I think that this sort of thing is going to become much more intensive. I think it's very likely. I don't want to catastrophize, right? Because you don't want to scare people, but I'd be very surprised if we don't get to the stage of individual lawyers being named and then doxed, or that being given an excuse for people to attack them. I mean, we've seen this elsewhere in Europe. God knows we've seen it here.
We've seen it here,
right?
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need to prosecute somebody. You just need to say their name publicly as an undesirable, and then
the rest
other people will take it from there, right? I mean, you saw it also in Britain last year after those riots triggered by Southport and the killings there. That immigration lawyers were targeted, doxed. Lists circulating on social media of their offices, and sometimes their offices were also their homes.
That's right.
And then, I mean, that lasted a few weeks, and then it, for now at least, died down. But that was a very scary few weeks for British lawyers, and I can see that happening in the US really very easily. In fact, I would be surprised if it doesn't start to happen on some level. Yeah.
And we've seen it happen with our colleagues in Ireland as well, in Dublin, who are all immigration lawyers. So quite a scary time. But as you said, it has died down for now. I
guess getting back to this idea of, reporting isn't enough. I think reporting is vital, but it's not enough. Talking to some of those lawyers in Britain last year, that what they wanted to happen in terms of protection, they wanted police protection. They wanted the legal associations to come out earlier and more forcefully to protect them. And then there were one or two other discussions which I don't have a view on. And first of all, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't really have the right to express a view here. But I don't even know quite what I think. But I know there was a good discussion around some of those lawyers on how you counter some of the rhetorical attacks. So, for instance, when you're invited to go on one of these far-right radio shows or television shows, do you have a blanket, no, we're not going to give you any of our oxygen there, we're not going to play this game where we are on just to attack us, which seems to me perfectly rational and sensible. But there were others who also, I think, making good points. Some of the lawyers saying, look, if you don't go on and at least argue your corner, then you just surrender the field, right? And I think it's, again, I'm not suggesting one course of action or another, but I think it's these sorts of conversations which I think are useful to have wherever you come out in the end. And so what happened there, I think, was a sort of the worst of both worlds in Britain last year, where one or two of the lawyers decided that they would take on these interviews, and then they got asked again and again and again, and they sort of ended up exhausted and really super vilified because there were only a couple of them doing it. And so, I think, I mean, this is just one example, but I think if that discussion is to be had, it ought to be done like collectively. And, either we're just not going to do it at all, fine, or if we are, there's going to be 20 or 50 of us sharing this. So it's not just
a support network there. And you're so right. I mean, I know some of the lawyers involved as well. And I mean, I'm in certain groups with them, in discussion groups, and it was a scary time. But then they get an influx of work coming their way as well, because that's, and they're not necessarily able to handle a lot of that too, as well as the vilification online. It's very personal. I mean, it's targeted and personal. So not easy. And I guess it's very much a personal decision, but I think that's a good discussion that should be had at least. But yes, it's on our doorstep, and who knows when anything's going to arise again. Just in terms of your career, and we're talking about lawyers and activism and all of that, and it's a question we get asked very often here with young people or graduates or people who are contemplating a career in human rights, not necessarily law. But firstly, I guess, about activism itself and becoming an activist or working in your line of work. Do you think there's a certain skill set that you need? Is it something you can work towards? Or like you were, your inspiration came from an early experience when you were 18 and 19 going to South Africa. What do you think makes an activist? And secondly, law or activism or both? And we get journalism as another thing that comes in. This is kind of firing these questions at you. But I'm just interested in your opinion, because we do have a lot of listeners and feedback about this, and I don't really know the answer. I'm just a lawyer.
Well, I'm not sure there is an answer, but I have views on this.
Good.
I really have pretty strong views on this, which is, I think, looking back over 30-something, nearly 40 years I've been doing this sort of thing, the whole landscape of activism has changed. It's become much more formal, much more professional, much more institutionalized. There are now courses, you can study at university on how to be a human rights lawyer or a human rights activist, and those just didn't exist when I was young. And I look back in my early days in Amnesty, and I mean that wasn't the early days of Amnesty. I joined Amnesty when it was celebrating its 30th birthday, right? Yeah. But most of the people working there at that time in London were young and from a much more diverse range of educational backgrounds than most NGOs are now, where many of the people there have a similar skill set, often a legal-based one. Yeah. We were from all over the place in terms of, some had been to university, some hadn't, some had done drama, some had done maths, some had done engineering. Like, that wasn't a barrier, and I think that's a very healthy thing. I think one of the ways which we've regressed over that generation is to promote the idea that you need to reach some sort of educational or even in experience a threshold before you can become an activist. And that's not true. Mm-hmm. And not only is it not true, I think it's counterproductive. Okay. So anyone can be an activist from 5 minutes from now, right? You just need something. And what I think one of the other imbalances which I see now being rectified, which is good, is a sort of I don't know about a glamour, but like an extra prestige to your activism if you were doing it abroad. Mm. Now, says he who does most of his activism abroad, right? But I think, if I were to advise somebody on if you want to work in this, and if you want a career in this, just start doing stuff locally. Whether that's working in the food bank or whatever else. You'll learn more. Now, it may not be recognised as such, but I think you'd learn more doing that in 6 months or 12 months than you would take in virtually any course I can think of. I'm not against people doing academic courses, of course not, or wanting to enter this world through the law. That's all fine. But I think that pathway has become too narrow, and we're more or less at a point now where we realise, look, the human rights professional movement, at least, now has a lot of lawyers. Yeah. Do we need more? Well, yeah, but we need a lot more of other life experiences too. Yeah. And I think that's a healthy thing. So I'd say to young people who are thinking about the idea that there's a human rights movement that you need to pass an exam to join is part of the problem, right? Mm-hmm. There isn't anything like that. So don't think that you need a law degree or a journalism degree or anything else. Just start doing stuff. Look, if I were screening CVs and I saw that somebody had, 6 or 12 months in local activism, for me that would count as a lot because I know roughly what that person has learned in that time.
Yeah. And I feel like we're seeing a rise in that with young people recently as well, getting more involved and becoming more active. I'm certainly seeing it locally with young people, which is good, and they're from all backgrounds and all professions and all careers.
I think that's very healthy. One thing I do worry about when I give talks at universities in Western Europe or the US, mm-hmm. I don't know beyond that, most of my work lately has been in those two arenas, is if I go to give a talk at a human rights course at university, whether it's in a law school or not, it's nearly all women. I mean,
really?
I don't just mean 70 or 80%. I mean like 95+%.
Really?
Right?
Gosh.
And I'm not quite sure, like, if that's a small problem or a big problem. Mm-hmm. But when you think to how young men, again, generalising here, but it's true, young men in Western Europe, also in South Korea, and certainly in the US, how young men are voting increasingly probably for far-right parties. Now, young people, again, generally speaking, used to vote more or less the same way, young men and young women, and now there's a big divergence over the last 10 years or so. And I worry that young men don't think that human rights has got anything to do with them. It's not their responsibility. Mm-hmm. Why should they be interested? I think that we could be at the start of something very unhealthy there.
Okay, gosh,
and trying to find a way to I don't want to say it like it's our fault that we need to include them because we're doing something wrong. I don't think that's right. But I think we need to understand why young men aren't wanting to work in human rights organisations or join the human rights movement in Western Europe and in the US. Elsewhere it might be a different picture, but I'm a bit worried about that.
That's your experience. Gosh, right. That's interesting. And of course, you've obviously spoken at many universities and institutes around the world. Here in Uri today, which you know, and you're on your way to Belfast. And you recently spoke in Derry as well about your career, which is great. And your knowledge, I suppose, in your research on the troubles and the conflict here in the north, I'm wondering, given as well you've personal connections with Ireland, how that has shaped your work and how maybe you approach reporting and research on different global conflicts.
It's hard. And I mean, it's a totally fair question. It's hard for me to give a sort of satisfying answer to a lot of these questions when somebody says, you know, how much did X affect you? Yeah. Like the answer is, I mean, clearly in my mind, absolutely it did. Like, you know, going to South Africa at a very young age. But trying to put a percentage on it, sure, you know, is very difficult. When I was growing up in London throughout the conflict, my parents were Irish, not particularly politically involved or engaged, really. And, you know, what was happening here, in some senses, was a million miles from what's happening in London. And yet there was always some shadow of it. I mean, especially in those early years, in the mid-70s. You know, bombing attacks virtually weekly in London between sort of 74 and 76, and then sporadically after. So it was never like it wasn't there, but it wasn't something that dominated everyday conversations, either at home or at school, where virtually all of the kids had the same background as me, and one or both Irish parents. I guess in terms of how it's fed into an appreciation of trying to report conflicts, again, I don't want to pretend I'm any world expert here. I've seen maybe half a dozen conflicts up close, and usually for a very short time. Once you've seen one, you realise how localised a lot of the violence is, how complicated it also is. I mean, I'm just back from, and I'm about to go to Ukraine again, and you know, you go into a town which was occupied by the Russians, and the Russians have now been forced out by the Ukrainian military. And there are very complicated levels of people who remain, some being accused by their neighbours of having been collaborators with the Russians during the occupation, because they were, some being accused by neighbours of collaborating because a neighbour doesn't like the neighbour. And then there's a lot of, you know, school settling and finger pointing, right? You see other people who just sort of try to pretend that it's all going to be over. They don't really care who's in charge of their village or town as long as, you know, the fighting stops. Other people who were putting up active resistance, people who pretended they were putting up active. There are always more than, when I don't say two sides to the conflict, I don't mean that literally. I mean there are just many viewpoints of how to see it and how to report it too.
Yeah, gosh. And just on that, I know you've written extensively as well on Irish history too, and I know you've an interest in Robert Kennedy as well.
I wrote that on a typewriter. There you go.
Is that your typewriter?
That was my typewriter. I read that in my 20s, and I was taking it all very seriously, like an academic book. I read it, parts of it recently, and I mean, it's pretty. You know, it's not awful, it's not turgid, but it's very earnest.
Oh, no. Well, look, you've written several books now, and you've written extensively on human rights, obviously activism and conflict, and biographical studies too. So this is a kind of a question we usually ask with any guests who are lawyers. It's the kind of relationship between the law and activism, and I'm going to ask you that in terms of your writing and activism, and how that can, you know, contribute to meaningful change on whatever level, whether it's local or global.
Well, I hope it does, because, you know, that's what I spent most of my time doing. I mean, some filming, but mostly writing. I think the most important one is the thing I mentioned earlier, is just to be able to recount people's stories and bring their stories of activism to an audience that they wouldn't otherwise be able to reach. So as long as you're telling that story with integrity and the right way and with their full consent, all the rest of it, then that's worth it. I think what is still undervalued, but important, is a sort of an analysis from what's really happening locally in a conflict. You still, when you see people who are given platforms on telly or in the print media, it's a lot of armchair experts still, who maybe have never been to a country, but they held some position in NATO years ago, and therefore they're seen as an expert on all sorts of stuff, right? So that's very frustrating, where I see local people who are assessing the situation with great perception. They don't really get the opportunity to explain to the world what's going on, whereas some bloke, and it's usually a bloke sitting in an armchair somewhere saying, oh, this is a classic case of Sunni Shia conflict, or a classic can you imagine how frustrating it must have been during the conflict here for people to hear commentators in the US or Australia, or God knows in London, getting really a lot of the stuff like horribly simplistically wrong. So trying to bring a bit of that nuance to it, I think is still worth it, but that's still an uphill battle.
Really, yeah. Well, I mean, your work is being recognised globally, and I think today you just got nominated for an award on
yeah, thank you
online.
Very much.
Congratulations.
I just got an award from the University of Oslo. It's marvellous. I mean, very unexpected. They called me a couple of days ago, and the woman said, we'd like to present you with the 2025 Human Rights Award. There'll be a ceremony in Oslo, and you'll be presented with a lithograph. I was like, great, thanks very much. I was furiously Googling, what is a lithograph, right?
What is it?
Well, it's some sort of art thing. Yeah. It's very posh looking. Yeah, it's like anyway, great. Yeah.
Very good. Well, congratulations on that. And I suppose finally, what's next and what's on the horizon for you over the next while, and with your work and your planning?
So I hope to carry on doing much the same, for the foreseeable future. I mean, in the next couple of years, the two big pieces of work that I'm biting into these days are around the conflict here and impunity. I worked with a international panel to produce a fairly hefty, sort of old style piece of research, really, in that it's hundreds of pages long. Usually that we don't do that anymore for good reasons, except exceptionally. And so this catalogues the extent of state impunity here during the conflict. Been working with local lawyers, local NGOs, Pat Finucane Centre, the CAJ and others, and also then work on Ukraine. I mean, I have no idea whether the Ukraine war is going to end soon or not. You listen to the armchair experts, you also get a lot of different views. But even when the conflict is over, my original work on Ukraine was around anti-corruption efforts by local activists. So, were the war to end like next week, which I doubt, there'd still be a lot of work to do then on anti-corruption. And then I'm working towards about halfway through a book. There's a human rights publisher in the US called Humanitas Media, and I'm writing profiles of local activists around Europe, people who didn't come up through a normal career path of working for an NGOs or journalists, or like just people who saw something needed to be done, so responded. There's a family in Poland who hid refugees in their home, a violinist in Ukraine who now drives an ambulance at the front line. There's a scientist in Turkey who was on a huge project to try and find out the level of toxins in drinking water. And when the Turkish government found out the results, which were horrifyingly high, tried to suppress the research. So this guy made it public, went on trial for being a terrorist, was eventually acquitted. But this is exactly what I'm talking about in terms of like the local activism and the responses, right? You don't need qualifications, you don't need training in human rights, you just need to recognise something is wrong and try to do something to fix it. And that's your activism.
And you're sharing their stories with us. I can't wait to read that. That sounds absolutely fantastic. Fascinating and vital work. Brian, thank you so much for joining me today in the studio. It's been fantastic.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service, where our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.